Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Advanced School Historical Formations of Spatial Knowledge. First, I would like to invite Professor Itzhak Chen, Director of the Institute, to come and greet us.
Welcome everyone to Israel, to Jerusalem, and to the Institute for Advanced Studies, which is, of course, the best institute for advanced studies around the world. Now, the Institute was founded 50 years ago. We're celebrating our 50th year, and ever since it was founded, we hosted almost 2,500 scholars in research groups and individual fellowships at the Institute. But apart from that, and that's what's unique about this Institute, is that we are holding each year 6 schools for advanced studies. That is, 6 schools which get together hundreds of PhD students to learn from the best of the best. And we have them in physics, mathematics, life sciences, computer science and engineering, economics, and of course, humanities. And it is 3 years since we had our last school of advanced studies in the humanities. First, it was COVID that interrupted us, and then it was the war. But I'm happy to see you all here, albeit the fact that the circumstances are not ideal. But still, we've managed to pull it out, and we managed to organize this institute. A lot thanks to Moshe Go, Zef, where is he?
He's stuck in traffic.
And of course, Tzur, and above all, Tony Grafton, who is the general director of this school. So I would like to thank them all for organizing it for you, and I would like to thank you all for coming and enjoying what the Institute for Advanced Studies has to offer you. So I wish you a fruitful week. The weather is going to be fantastic. So enjoy it. Thanks.
I will say a few introductory words. Moshe then will add some of his own. As you've heard, Zef unfortunately is stuck in a huge traffic jam on road number 6, but he will join us later, and then in 25 minutes we will hold the keynote or opening lecture by Professor Grafton. So, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to the Advanced School Historical Formations of Spatial Knowledge, a week-long joint exploration of this broad theme. I'm Tzur Shalev. I'm a historian of early modern Europe in teaching at the University of Haifa. This project has been close to 5 years in the making, and I've actually went back to my emails and saw Tony's first invitation to launch this advanced school. As general director of the Humanities School at the Institute, he offered to study the history of visions of the Earth's surface. So more or less, I think we are still dealing with the same topic, but with a few other approaches and emphasis that were added. And I was lucky that Dr. Zef Segal and Dr. Moshe Yagur, who will shortly introduce themselves, both agreed to join the organizing team. I should also mention Professor Jordana Din, editor of Imago Mundi. I'm assuming all of you know Imago Mundi, and well, you should if you're here. She was involved in the early stages of planning this advanced school. As Professor Chen said, we had our twists and turns along the way, including epidemic and war, and the fact that we are all seated here, ready to delve into the past, is both surprising and reassuring. The war, however, is still around us in the present. This cannot and should not be ignored as we discuss methods, concepts, and transmissions of spatial knowledge and conflicting territorialities. Spatial knowledge is an umbrella term meant to encapsulate both the representational aspects of human space as well as its historicity and mutability. We wish to emphasize the development of geographical concepts as a process conditioned by political, social, and cultural contexts to study change, controversy, and transmission between eras and cultures. To tackle this broad field, we divided the week into 4 broad themes: reception and transmission, urban spaces, travel and mobility, and territoriality. And of course, we could have divided the theme differently, but considering the teaching staff and the interests of the student body, this is the program we devised. We cover a range of periods, cultures, and methods, a wide spectrum which is also reflected by the interests of our student group, ranging from late antique Mesopotamia to 20th century Eastern Europe and across disciplines, from the theory of art to linguistics and, of course, history. So there's a lot to look forward to in this week. I would like to thank the Israeli Institute for Advanced Study for hosting us so generously and for the dedicated and professional team which guided us along the way. Professor Yitzhak Chen, Iris Avivi, and above all, Anatya Gil, with whom you've all corresponded, I'm sure. So now I'd like to invite my colleague, Moshe Yagur, to say a few words about the week ahead.
Okay, so shalom everyone. My name is Moshe Yagur. I'm a historian of the medieval Middle East, Jewish history and relation to Jews and others, specifically in specific special terms. And now what I'll do is I'll just mention briefly what we're going to do. We all have the program with you and the links, just to give a broad idea of what we're doing. So today, the first day, we have the keynote lecture of Professor Grafton. After lunch, we'll have the time for sessions for the short presentations of each of you, so we can get to know you a little better, and you can get to know, all of us can get to know each other and what we're doing and why we came here. And almost every day, I think, of the school, we'll have like an excursion outside. We're dealing with space. So today afternoon, we're going to have navigation in this campus of Givat Ram, led by Zef, who is not here, so he will explain later. He will be here. He's on the way. What we are going to do exactly, we will use maps for navigation run, but no need to run in this section. And we'll see how exactly we use these specific maps, what they tell us, what they don't tell us. Then we'll have reception. Tomorrow we'll have 2 sessions here in the morning in the next room, like at the seminar room. And then after lunch we'll go out to the National Library to see the building, to see some of the special documents there, and the session of Tzur. On Tuesday we have also 3 sessions here in the seminar room, and then we'll go to the Israel Museum to see the model of Second Temple Jerusalem with Professor Eyal Ben Eliyahu, who will join us for that, and to see just a small section of the exhibition from this specific angle of space and how you present space in a museum. Wednesday, we'll have 2 more presentations, and then afternoon we have time to work in groups, and Zef will explain also about that, and meeting office hours with the different lecturers. And then Tuesday, the last day, in the morning, we'll have a tour. We planned the tour inside the old city, but due to university regulations, we'll do a tour getting out of the old city and into the new city, the new neighborhoods outside of the wall. So we'll talk about these aspects, and then we'll come back here for a final session of the teachers with Zeph, and then for concluding remarks. So this is the program in general, and of course we invite you to share, to note, to link between the different sessions, and to contribute whatever you have. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Imagine I'm Zeph for a moment. Well, one of the perhaps methods or new developments in the field relate to digital humanities, and of course spatial history is a major area of interest in this emerging field. So I'm really consider myself as ignorant in this particular theory and approach, and I really look forward to learning more about that. So, but this would be another component we've added to our week. Probably some of you, and I know some of you are already working and thinking with digital tools in your individual research projects. So this is another aspect of the week ahead. We will now take a short break and get ready for the keynote lecture, and see you at 2 minutes to 11 here. Okay. This room? Yeah, in this room. Okay.
Si je pars mardi matin, parce que j'ai un avion mardi à 5h30, une heure bien à 11h. 11h à midi et demi. En français ou en English? No, no, no. Nederland Le programme est un peu gros. Avec ma pita et mon hummus. Oui, mais c'est ta chaîne.
לא נבלבל בין השניים, ולכן לקח כל השבוע.
אמרתי באמת, איזה שטות שלא שלחתי.
אני צריך להגיד עכשיו שלום דניאל לא, כי ניסיתי להגיד עכשיו שלום. לא, בטח. לא, מה, לא להיכנס, זה באלה. לא, ברור, אנחנו עושים כללים. כן, ישבנו אצל חברים לפני שבועיים, משהו באוניברסיטת תל אביב, חוקים, יש רגעים שאני אומר, לא, השניים שאני Je parle maintenant. Oui, oui. ב-20 שאלות של הארץ, השאלה, כן, הייתה שאלה, זה ספר של סופרת אמריקאית. קראו לו בעברית מחלקיים של כסף. הסיפור, פעם ראשונה שהסיפור עולה לרעיון מופיע, מופיע שם לפי 20 שאלות של הארץ. מה את אומרת? הרבה מאמץ. או שאתה מקווה שיש גם פלוסטר, שאני אומר לך. מדהים. סיפור. אבל אם אתה חד לזה מאיפה
איש ב...
אני אראה אם אני נמצא אותו ומתי אני מגיע לה. סתם בדור.
I couldn't resist. Okay. Good day everyone. I'm Tzur Shalev, a historian of early modern Europe at the University of Haifa, and I'll be chairing this session. Let me get rid of the unpleasant part. Unfortunately, post-talk lunch is for school participants only. Okay? Did I do well or not? Okay. Thank you. Okay. So it is with special delight. It is a special delight to introduce to you Professor Anthony Grafton, the Henry Putnam University Professor of History at Princeton University, where I was lucky 20 years ago to complete a dissertation under his guidance. Professor Grafton's studies in the cultural and intellectual history of early modern Europe are familiar to all of us. From the study of chronology to antiquarianism and the history of the book, to mention only a few subjects, Tony, if I may, has broken new ground and led the way to many others. As this is the opening lecture to an advanced school in the humanities centered on space, urban space, and its representations, I would like to mention Grafton's contribution to this field as well, beginning with Rome Reborn, the Vatican Library and Renaissance Culture, an exhibition he curated and displayed at the Library of Congress in 1993. More recently, a book co-authored with Maren Schwab on titled The Art of Discovery on Early Archaeology in Rome, Britain, and other locations. An article in Renaissance Quarterly on Alberti and Old St. Peter's, and we will hear more about Alberti shortly. And another article with William Tice on Piero Cennini and his description of the Florentine Baptistry, 2022, the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes. I should also mention his newest book with Joanna Weinberg on Johann Buxtorf, just out. So I would like to invite Tony Grafton to speak to us on space and power in Renaissance Rome. Please.
Thank you very much, Tzur, for that kind introduction. And, my thanks, first of all, to the Institute for Advanced Study for its hospitality for this school, to Tzur and his colleagues for getting the school organized against many, many obstacles. I was skeptical, but I've known Tzur for a long time, and I should have realized that once he had set his mind on it, it was going to happen, and it is. And finally, I'm very grateful to your willingness to hear me talk, which always takes some patience, as my late wife always informed me. I'm talking about a subject, my teacher, Arnaldo Momigliano, often looked around an audience at the beginning of a talk and said, of course, everyone here knows far more than I do about the subject that I'm going to address. And then he would stare, and you knew that if you believed him, you would turn to stone. But I can say this knowing that the speakers who will be coming in our course for our students do know far more about this, these subjects of space and knowledge than I do, and will be able to correct my errors and emphases in a wonderful way. So this is, I realized also finally that I left one word out of the title. It should really be space, power, and knowledge. But too much Foucault made me allergic to putting power and knowledge in the same clause, so I didn't put it there. Early in the 1450s, Leon Battista Alberti completed a draft of his treatise on the art of building. This is the first modern book not only on architecture, but also on city planning, on buildings of many types, bridges, arches, roads, and how they all fit together into a complex unity. In the preface, which was meant for patrons like Pope Nicholas V, his main patron at the time, he made his understanding of space clear. It was the architect's understanding of space. Space was there to be changed. Space was plastic. Space was full of material that you could make into other things, and forms that you could make into other forms. And he really hurls every possible instance of this into one basket as he tries to show the patron how much architects can do. By cutting through rock, by tunneling through mountains or filling in valleys, by restraining the waters of the sea and lakes, and by draining marshes, through the building of ships, by altering the course and dredging the mouths of rivers, and through the construction of harbors and bridges, the architect has not only met the temporary needs of man, but also opened up new gateways to all the provinces of the world. As a result, nations have been able to serve each other by exchanging fruit, spices, experience, and knowledge, anything that might improve our health and standard of living. The architect had done many other things. He had created mills, clocks, and other devices that improved the efficiency of human life. He had built swimming pools and baths to keep us healthy, and war machines to destroy cities and defend them. The ancients, however, had emphasized one achievement of the architects above all others. They made beautiful buildings, buildings which embodied the power and wealth of their states and the wisdom and magnanimity of their rulers. The Greek historian Thucydides, for example, did well to praise the ancients who had the vision to adorn their cities with such a rich variety of buildings as to give the impression of having far greater power than they really had. Has there been one among the greatest and wisest of princes who did not consider building one of the principal means of preserving his name for posterity? Now, this is an interesting quotation. Alberti probably consulted Thucydides in the New Vatican Library, where his work was available in the first Latin translation by Lorenzo Valla, just completed in 1452. And Valla translated this passage pretty correctly, and the meaning of the passage is a little surprising when you've just read Alberti. For Thucydides says, talking about the origins of the Peloponnesian War, if Sparta, which was of course austere without great buildings, were to become desolate and the temples and foundations of public buildings were left, posterity would refuse to accept her fame as a true exponent of her power. But if Athens were to suffer the same misfortune, one could infer from her appearance that her power was twice as great as it is. Thucydides was explaining why Athens went into the war and why it lost it. The great buildings of Athens had given the Athenians themselves a false sense of their own power and their own wealth, which had helped, with many other factors, to lead them into disaster. Alberti was offering what I think has to be called a strong interpretation of this passage. Actually, he was overturning it. Now, I'm not giving a C+ to Alberti in Greek. His Greek was very good, but it just goes to show how seriously he believed that buildings mattered and that buildings had power, and that buildings expressed the greatness of rulers in a way that nothing else did. So much so that he would overturn a great classical writer, turn his sentence on its head in order to provide further evidence. In fact, nobody minded. Bernardo Bembo and Konrad Peutinger were learned patricians, readers of Alberti, and patrons of architecture, and both of them simply took this as a good point and noted it down for further use. And it's probably not surprising that Alberti's misuse of Thucydides won approval. He captured something about the intellectual and the practical life of the city of Rome, where he spent a good part of his own career in the middle decades of the 15th century. When the papacy came back early in 1420 to the city of Rome, it was not even a shadow of its one-time imperial self. A city built for 1 million with a population of 20,000. The Forum was where the great dramas of the Roman Republic had taken place, was now grazing land for sheep, almost completely empty. Its inhabited areas, famous for their narrow streets and the porticos and archways that projected out into them, making it extremely difficult to get by and indeed extremely difficult to control the city when revolutions took place, as they frequently did. These streets filled up with rubbish of all kinds, sometimes so much so that they rotted the houses on either side, which began to collapse. Undignified little shops obscured the atrium of St. Peter's, which we'll see in a bit, and the pillars of the Pantheon. After all, as one visiting humanist remarked, Romans only knew how to do two things: sell visitors pictures of the Savior and burn ancient buildings for lime so that they could build modern hovels. Yet somehow, amid all the ruins and the mess, a new city rose. It was not a coherent enterprise, as we've learned from the great explosion of architectural and urban history of the last half century and more. Each pope had his own ideas about which bit of the city he wanted to change and how. Plans were often not fully completed. Even by the end of the 16th century, streets were often unpaved. People with no work, ill-sick people wandered the streets, even though the popes built hospitals for them. Yet in 1580, when Montaigne visited Rome, he had to admit that its public spaces put those in Paris and any other city he'd seen to shame. Something had happened. I'll be looking today at the very beginning of this story, and particularly in the way in which knowledge, the knowledge of the city's intellectuals known as humanists, functioned in the planning and transformation of the city. Now, when the popes returned to Rome, the city had two centers of power and attraction, as is well known. So on your left at the bottom, you see Trastevere, the papal region of the city around St. Peter's, which was already becoming the dominant basilica in a city of basilicas, the most important site for pilgrims and others. And on the right, in the center of the image, Pietro del Massaio, you see the Capitoline Hill, where the secular government of the so-called senator had its seat. And so there are the two Romes, the Rome of the aristocracy, who ran the Roman Republic, as it called itself, and papal Rome. Now, the Roman government did not look particularly powerful. The palace of the senator, which you see here, was pretty ramshackle. And the hill looked nothing like it would once Michelangelo finished revising it and reconfiguring it so that it responded to the papal lands across the river. But it had its symbols. Above all, this wonderful Greek statue of the lion attacking a horse is a wonderful piece of classical statuary, which you can see with the little blue arrow on the ramp leading up to the palace. And it was a place that had a significant position in Roman political culture. It was near here that Cola di Rienzo proclaimed his republic in 1347, near here that he died making his last stand when his second republic collapsed. Here in the 15th century, in the early 15th century, this is an imaginative vision of it, not fully clear whether it's the ancient or the modern Capitoline, but I love the image. Here, statutes were made in the palace, official announcements were posted on the gates, and criminals were humiliated or executed depending on the level of their crimes. The government had officers who were responsible for vital functions. For example, the three men who served as masters of the streets and were responsible for forbidding, and I quote, butchers, fishmongers, shoemakers, tanners, and other diverse artisans from throwing viscera, intestines, heads, feet, bone, blood, skins, rotten meat, and fish, and other fetid and corrupt things into the streets and piazza. Now, across the Tiber, the center of papal power was formally located around St. Peter's Basilica. But from the start, I'd like to emphasize that papal power was never limited to that basilica. Imperfectly and in partial ways, it extended itself through two different forms of spatial domination, neither of them limited to its fortified base across the Tiber. In the first place, Rome was a city of basilicas. The 7 major and minor basilicas, for example, to which pilgrims came, especially in the Jubilee years that became increasingly important. With the 1450 one was probably the first great and successful Jubilee. And so pilgrims came and they walked what were sometimes difficult paths through farms to get to these basilicas, but if you made the complete tour, you had a lot of good indulgences to take home. So many pilgrims came in 1450 that a crush developed in the Borgo, and the rush onto the bridge, a couple of hundred were forced off the bridge into the Tiber and drowned. This is an image of it probably after Leon Battista Alberti had designed a reconstruction that would prevent this in future. We can see what a pilgrim saw and why he wanted to see it from the very good records kept by Alberti's principal Florentine patron, Giovanni Rucellai, the scion of a rich family of wool merchants for whom Alberti built the Rucellai Palace, with its wonderful facade, and redid the Church of Santa Maria Novella. And you can see Giovanni Rucellai's name proudly inscribed in very beautiful capitals across the facade. So Giovanni came to Rome with a bucket list of things that he wanted to see. He was rich enough that he could ride to the sites he wanted to visit rather than walk. And he did so very systematically. Churches in the morning, antiquities in the afternoon. He was very impressed by Old St. Peter's, and this is our real one surviving image of half of the nave still standing at the end of the 16th century, which gives you an idea of what, especially of the wonderful roof beams, where there were 96 altars and a priest celebrating Mass at every one of them. It must have sounded a bit like actually I can't imagine what it sounded like, but it must have sounded like complete bedlam. He appreciated the relics of many kinds, which were the chief content of his bucket list. And so at the Vatican, as you can see on your left, he saw the spiral pillars, which had come supposedly from the temple at Jerusalem, and not from Herod's temple, but from Solomon's. The one that's farthest over on your left was the one that Jesus had touched, and which those possessed, if they touched it, would find themselves cured, as he noted down. He saw the Veronica, or Sudarium, formally displayed and found that very impressive as well. At the Lateran, he saw the heads of Peter and Paul in a different set of reliquaries, the ones that he saw were destroyed in the sack. And at the Church of St. Paul, outside the walls, he saw a magnificent manuscript of the Vulgate Bible, actually written by the hand of St. Jerome, or so he said. The priests call this a relic. And that was probably because it's actually a Carolingian Bible, has nothing to do with St. Jerome except for the text. Lorenzo Valla had pointed this out, and I suspect Alberti told his patron not to believe what the priests told him about the book, but he still noted it down. This just gives you a sense of the way that the whole city was knitted together by a network of sites of devotion, as if they were little power stations drawing down celestial influence, and only someone who had touched all of them got the complete benefit of a trip to the city. This was part of papal power, and a very important part, and one that kept increasing, is in 1492, the papacy received the gift of the fragment of the Holy Lance that wounded Jesus on the cross. They only worried for a while about the fact that it was also in Nuremberg, where it was part of the city's treasury, as you can see on this broadside, but finally they decided to display it, and it is now one of the chief relics of the Vatican. Also in 1492, just in time, conveniently to celebrate the conquest of Granada, the placard from the top of the cross in which Jesus was crucified was discovered and widely publicized. It was so hard to read that they actually filled the letters with sand and ink. It's the first use of this kind of technology, which will eventually become the epigraphic squeeze. But it's truly important to see how vital all of this was to papal control, as was the appointment of priests and the cooperation with religious orders throughout the city. The popes also took concrete political and urbanistic steps to enhance their control of the city. Nicholas V took steps, for example, to bring the urban government more and more under papal control. He repaired the senatorial palace very beautifully, but he also insisted that the master of the streets come under the papal government and receive papal support, including a tax that would support rubbish collection and a schedule for the times when people would have to remove the fecal matter and other things from in front of their houses. And he also took responsibility, and here too you can see the papacy extending its control over judicial matters more and more, as Margaret Meserve has shown in a wonderful book that I can never resist citing, Papal Bull, possibly the best title of a book in the Renaissance in the last 20 years. The papacy took responsibility for civil and criminal justice. It took responsibility for making legal enactments, and it developed a system for publicizing them with runners who went through the city posting them on important public places, including the senatorial palace, the Campo dei Fiori, which became more and more important in the city's life, and the gates and the doors of Old St. Peter's itself. This is the atrium of Old St. Peter's, and the doors behind it became an important place for legal affairs here. For example, Sigismondo Malatesta, a soldier of fortune, was not only an enemy of the papacy, he was actually damned formally. The only person we know is in hell, as Bartolus the lawyer is the only person we actually know for sure is in heaven. But he was out of papal reach, so the papacy punished 3 surrogates, dummies of Sigismondo with banderoles coming out of their mouths confessing their sins, were burned in public, one of them here in front of St. Peter's, one in the Campo dei Fiori. Other criminals were punished more seriously and directly. So papal power was extending itself, and when Nicholas rebuilt the Leonine city, as it's often called, the papal part of the city, this was very much part of a larger program. The Leonine city was fortified. He built a splendid new style bastion there as a sort of base for all the fortifications. He built the walls. He rebuilt the papal palace, which you can see behind there. So there's a whole set of work that he starts doing early in his pontificate in the 1440s. And then as he becomes acquainted with Alberti, his plans become more and more optimistic and all-embracing and less likely actually to be carried out. And it's in this period that he planned the straightening of the streets in Trastevere and the building of a real processional district that would move processions in a very dignified way from the Castel Sant'Angelo and the Tiber to St. Peter's. What matters here is partly, of course, the way in which the papacy provided itself with a safe harbor in time of trouble. When Stefano Porcari tried to rebel against Nicholas, he was easily caught, executed, and hung from the Castel Sant'Angelo as an example to others, whereas Nicholas's predecessor had been driven out of Rome by rebellious citizens only 20 years before. But more important, I think, is the way in which this was part of a comprehensive program. Nicholas himself became known. He's really the first pope who becomes known in public memory for this, as someone whose cultural patronage was essential to his work as pope. He spent, like a madman, they said, on three things: buildings, books, and I'll come back to the books, and vestments. Vestments, by the way, and I give this away for free, this is one of the last great fields of art and culture which remain almost completely unexplored. Many, many European cathedrals have magnificent vestments in their museums and in their closets, works of mostly female art which are very little studied and were as important to Nicholas as anything else. And for a reason. When Pius II brought the head of St. Andrew to the Vatican, he had the entire clergy of Rome dressed in white, in uniform vestments. They stretched from the Milvian Bridge all the way to St. Peter's. So he filled the city with uniformly clad people. That was as powerful a demonstration, probably, as the buildings. So, one of the ways in which Nicholas combined cultural patronage with building, and my own favorite, was the library, the massive library that he made part of his palace in beautifully frescoed rooms. It was filled with books that were specially commissioned and became a place where you could read, for example, more and more of the great works of classical Greece, which had never been available in Latin translations. This is Valla's translation of Thucydides, and Valla actually meant this to be a sort of model copy, which all other copies would be made from, though of course that didn't actually happen. The library was a chained library in the normal way of the 15th century. It had strict rules. This is the only copy of the rules that were posted on the door, forbidding anyone from speaking in a quarrelsome way or as crossing the desks and tearing up the books with his feet. But rigor was mitigated by the fact that you could borrow books from the Vatican. You borrowed them, as the record tells us, cum catena, with the chain that normally held them to the desk, a good reminder that they weren't yours. And when you returned them, they were crossed off the Vatican's register of loans. And as we will see in a little bit, this sense of a kind of interdisciplinary center of research and argument is really crucial to the larger story. Now, the popes were generally interested in, many of the popes were generally interested in antiquities. Pius II, after Nicholas, forbade the looting of antiquities after looting a great many of them himself for his own building projects. But even before that, after that, we have the extraordinary project of Sixtus IV. Some of the most charged antiquities, the ones that had been listed in guides to Rome since the Middle Ages, like the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius and the remains of the colossal statue of Constantine, were at the Lateran, very distant from the center of Rome. Sixtus IV in 1474 had them moved to the Capitoline, you can just about see the equestrian statue in the middle. It's not a very clear image. It's a copy from Heemskerk. The Pope's tolerance was limited. In 1485, when a Roman woman was found perfectly preserved on the Appian Way and brought to the Capitoline, where for 3 days the entire population of Rome, humanists, artists, alchemists, came to see her, to study her body, to tweak her nose, pull out her tongue, work out, that's what the alchemists did, how she had been preserved so well. At the Pope's orders, her body was finally disappeared out the Porta Salaria. So that was a little too classical even for Innocent VIII. But on the whole, the Pope supported classical erudition. And it's important to remember that the Vatican Library was a classical library in the first instance, more than anything else. Now, images of Rome transform themselves in this period. There are great medieval images. Cimabue's image, he of course had been to Rome himself before he made this wonderful fresco in the 1480s in Assisi, wonderfully just crams together major buildings of Rome. At the back, you've got both the senatorial palace here and Old St. Peter's. You've got the Pantheon, you've got the Castel Sant'Angelo, you have the Tower of the Militias. These are the most prominent and famous Roman monuments, just sort of pushed together. And the point here is not spatial but ideological. The point is to show that under the leadership of Pope Nicholas and Orsini, Rome as political entity and Rome as religious entity had come together. The Palace of the Senators has Orsini shields on it, though you can't really see them, along with other shields saying SPQR. By the middle of the 15th century, the views change. They tend to take Monte Mario as their viewing point, but they, as Jessica Meyer has shown wonderfully, they pull what you see upwards as if you were in a drone above Monte Mario rather than on the hill itself. It's the hill you come to Rome from the north as a pilgrim. So here, from the 1440s, from Fazio de Uberti's Encyclopedic Dittamondo, there's an extra A there, sorry, you see an image which on the one hand is much more like an image of Rome. You can see papal Rome here, the center of Rome there. There's chief interest is in churches, though there are columns and other monuments. But it's also an ideological image in that there's nothing to cut off the Trastevere from the city. It's all one set of walls rather than two. So once again, an image with a lot of ideology behind it. In the period right after this image was drawn, in the period of Nicholas and Pius and Sixtus, a great project gets going, a project which really changes, I think, the way that Nicholas and others thought about what they were doing in the city, and a project that has enormous intellectual as well as urbanistic consequences. And the people in the course will hear much more about this in the future days, but there are two great enterprises, one to map the city in a rigorous way, one to represent it in views that give a sense of the feel of the city and the feel of its different sections. And both of these are extremely rich and extremely powerful. And both of them are informed by the intellectual activity that's centering in the Vatican. This is a world, the papal curia, of intellectuals. They're hired to be secretaries, to write on order for the Pope, and abbreviators, a lower rank where you wrote papal briefs. But they have spare time, like the humanists at other Italian courts, and they're able to invest it, a lot of it, in antiquarianism, the serious study of the Rome of the city's past. There were two ways that you could do this, equally important. One in the streets, the other in the Vatican and other libraries, reading the texts that recorded ancient and pseudo-ancient descriptions of the city and its quarters and its aqueducts and so on. Poggio Bracciolini writes a wonderful book on the varieties of fortune, which uses the misfortunes of Rome as its example, and with that pretext gives you a survey of ancient buildings, one after another, with instructions about how to see and think about places that have been built and rebuilt, like the Aurelian walls. Biondo Flavio surveyed the entire city, examining it building by building, quarter by quarter. Maffeo Veggio, who never gets as much credit as he did the same for Old St. Peter's in a fantastic book, which is really a deep study of that basilica from its late antique creation to his own time. We actually owe Veggio the knowledge that though the legend of the donation of Constantine was false, the idea that Constantine actually started building the church was true. It's he who preserved the evidence for that, though he also thought the story of the donation was false. To get an idea of these men's spirit, here's a letter of Biondo's describing a ride down the Appian Way. I saw aqueducts, an insane work that no one who has not seen them could believe. Monuments of those ancient men of divine virtue, there are villas, structures of various uses, built of square stones of immense size, covered or built of such great marbles that it seems beyond human power to have constructed such things. That at least makes the mistake of those who assert that Virgil created them by magical incantations a bit less ridiculous. I became so engaged and almost insane as I looked at them that the horse that carried me, actually agile and quick, seemed sleepy and flaccid. So this is a world of antiquarian passion, and it's also a world of antiquarian discovery. Veggio was the first person to describe the great sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, the late antique Roman, buried right by the tribune at the end of St. Peter's, and the silk threads that went through his funeral clothing, and that still fascinated my colleague Peter Brown. I think it's not unfair to say that the most powerful of all of these intellects and the most powerful explorer of the city was Leon Battista Alberti. And you see him here in a self-portrait drawing, a novelty for the time, and you see his emblem, the winged eye, and his motto, quid tum, which translates pretty well into the vernacular of Brooklyn, my future home. You want to make something of it? And gives a sense of the way he responded to criticism. Alberti, of course, was an extraordinary figure. Many of you know the unforgettable description of him in Jakob Burckhardt, the man who could throw a coin so high that it rang on the ceiling of the Florentine cathedral, could jump over the head of a man standing next to him, made an art out of three things: walking, riding, and conversing. Unfortunately, all of these facts come from a biography of Alberti written in the third person, which we now know was written by Alberti himself, which makes us maybe a little dubious about them. But he was someone who he did immensely impress everyone around him, and he did make himself not into an architect so much as an architectural consultant. He did do a certain amount of building, but he was also used by the great men who supported architectural projects to give them designs, to give them suggestions, which others would then usually execute. And he was sharp and critical, as befits a consultant. Talking to Nicholas about the Old St. Peter's, he said, "I've noticed a crass feature in this basilica, an extremely long and high wall that has been constructed over a continuous series of openings, with no curves to give it strength and no buttresses to lend it support. Eventually, some gentle pressure will make it collapse." Not the sort of thing that the patron probably wants to hear. There's a wonderful passage on the art of building where Alberti actually says, "Don't listen to people who come with great ambitious projects. Just don't listen to them." Anyone who has lived on an American campus with money will know how right he was, as our presidents carry out Tacitus's project of making a desert and calling it peace, as they tend to do. He was passionate about architecture and urban planning, and he saw Rome as a kind of playground where he could find the best possible models and also some mistakes to avoid. All of his friends shared this passion for Roman antiquity. All of them shared this passion for using all of the senses to understand what the city had been, sight for measurement, hearing to get a sense of the scale of buildings, touch to get an understanding of materials. All of them had this passion to know what a building had been used for and tried to imagine what the complete buildings had been like in antiquity. If you've ever wondered, this is what the baths of Diocletian looked like. I particularly like the nice man in the towel coming out of the door. But this is an enterprise that really has no precedent in earlier scholarship, at least on this kind of scale. But Alberti's version of it was particular because he was an architectural consultant, because he trained himself in measurement and mathematical skills. He not only examined the city, he not only looked to identify structures, but he looked to measure the whole city. No building of the ancients that had attracted praise, whatever it might be, but I immediately examined it carefully to see what I could learn from it. Therefore, I never stopped exploring, considering, and measuring everything, comparing the information through line drawings until I had grasped and understood fully what each had to contribute in terms of ingenuity and skill. So Alberti made ground plans and elevations of, at least so he says, every building in the city. That's perhaps ambitious, but it is a tragedy that we don't have a single one of these drawings now. Very common, actually, for Renaissance architecture. It's extraordinary how few drawings survive, given how many buildings they built. This is the one drawing we have. It's the plan for a bath. Quite a nice bath, but it doesn't really make up for the loss. Alberti's drawings are gone, but we can examine one project, not the project for studying a single building, but a project for studying the city as a whole, which documents do survive for. In his Ludi Mathematici, and this is a set of mathematical problems and solutions, a very common genre in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries. He describes a special instrument, a circular instrument, which I use for pleasurable things, such as how to measure the site of a town or the picture of a place, as I did when I depicted Rome. So evidently he made a picture of Rome. We don't have that, but we do have his detailed instructions for how to make a picture of Rome, the so-called description of the city of Rome, in which, as he says, he tried to tabulate, and you see on the left tables of coordinates, the directions and lines of the walls of the city of Rome, and the rivers and the roads, and the sites and placement of temples and public works, and gates and trophies, and the boundaries of the hills, and the space that is roofed over for habitation. So a very comprehensive vision of the city as a whole. The coordinates are polar. You have two coordinates for each. Using this instrument, which he calls a horizon, one coordinate tells you what angle you see it at looking from the center, which he placed in the Capitoline Hill. The other coordinate tells you its distance from the center of the Capitoline Hill. Taken together, you can place every point that's listed rigorously on that circular instrument that he showed you before. In the Ludi, finally, he actually has methods which give a sense for how he worked out the distances between his Capitoline viewing point and other buildings, triangulation and an odometer. And though people are very assertive about which of these he used, I don't actually see that the evidence supports either of them very quickly. Now, this was an amazing project. Alberti had one thing in common with Elon Musk. He liked to do things with as few means as possible, to use the same tool for a great many different purposes. The horizon, this circular tool with a pointer, is actually an astrolabe. It starts as a tool for observing the heavens. Alberti was a very skilled observer. He actually did observation with Paolo Toscanelli, one of the great scientists of the time in Florence. But he used it for many purposes. With a plumb bob on the end, it was usable for, as he shows in his book on sculpture, actually tabulating the shape of a statue so precisely that you could duplicate it. He used the same for working out the proportions of individual human bodies. He even made it into a circular drill with which he drilled the name of Bernardo Rucellai, his second patron, into the entry stone of Santa Maria Novella, or so at least Vasari tells us. So it's a brilliant and ingenious piece of work, this creation of a tool. How do we explain it? Well, we've seen this is a city with one great library, lots of scribes, lots of scholars, and it's often, this description of Rome has often been connected to something that the course members will see at the visit to the library, the Atlas of Claudius Ptolemy, the greatest astronomer of Greek antiquity, who in the 2nd century CE created a massive atlas in which he tabulated longitudes and latitudes for thousands of places, in the sense that we know them, and gave instructions for drawing maps with them, with various forms of cartography, each of which could do certain things the other couldn't. Copies of Ptolemy were the rage in 15th century Italy. Patrons loved them. One of Poggio's books begins with Cosimo de' Medici staring at the beautiful maps. These were made by Pietro da Massaia, whose view of Rome we've already seen, and with all this lovely view of blue. And it's certainly true that Alberti knew these maps. In one of my favorite of his works, his praise of the fly, he says, "They say that Ptolemy the mathematician drew his picture of the world from the flies, for they say that the Ganges, the Danube, the Nile, and the Po are splendidly depicted on the wings of flies, beautifully depicted in triangles, rectangles, and hexagons, with intersecting parallels drawn perpendicular to one another. They show the mountains and the rivers." And this is a very good description of the maps I've just shown you, and shows how well he knew them. And yet, and Rome, I should say, becomes a great center for the study of Ptolemy. Donus Nicholas Germanus, a scribe and maker of copies of Ptolemy, settled in Rome, and one of his manuscripts, though not the one we have, was the basis for the 1478 Rome printed edition of Ptolemy, the first one to be printed with reasonably good versions of the maps, and Tremet was often reprinted and very influential. Donus Nicolaus also made 2 globes for the Vatican Library, one of them terrestrial and one of them celestial. They were about 1 meter high. They were on wooden platforms. You could turn them. We don't have them or even an image of them, but here from Pollaiuolo and Bramante we have images of globes. And what's fascinating about this one, as cartographers have mentioned, is that the Indian Ocean, which is closed in Ptolemy's world map, is actually open, as it really was. So there's some kind of very innovative thought going on among globe makers in the 1460s and 70s, and one of the places where that's happening is Rome. So it has been normal to say, I've said it myself, that Alberti's description of Rome is part of this revival of ancient knowledge, and that is itself a very important story, but I don't think it's an adequate story. And the reason is simple. When it comes to long features on a map, Ptolemy is more unsatisfactory than he is with regard to other features. When he gives you the coordinates for a river, for example, he usually just gives you the mouth. Sometimes he'll give you another geographical feature that it touches. When he gives you the coordinates for a mountain chain, he usually just gives you the middle mountain in the chain. And so if you compare a nice Ptolemaic map of the Nile with a map of the Nile, you get a sense of how hard it was for him to put features like that on a map. He's much better at putting single features on a map than he is at these larger structures and elements. And that's exactly what Alberti thought he had to do. If he was going to portray the city, he had to be able to show its walls, its river, the Tiber, which split, and its roads. And he does a pretty good job. There's a great reconstruction by Vagnetti on the right, well, on your left, sorry, which shows you what he did, and here a more recent one by Zuboff that shows what he gets wrong. And it really is a pretty remarkable approximation, considering the conditions within which he worked and the fact that he was working on his own. So what's central for Alberti is precisely what was secondary for Ptolemy. How do you represent the lines of walls. How do you represent the line of a river? Well, you have to give coordinates for them. How do you give coordinates for them? And this is the problem Alberti thought he had solved. In his Descriptio, he not only gives the coordinates for places, he gives the coordinates for what he calls the aux of the walls, plural auges. Aux is not a geographical term, it's an astronomical term. And Alberti himself was an astronomer. The Vatican Library was full of astronomical texts, in particular Ptolemy's great work, the Almagest, the greatest astronomical work of antiquity. And in Ptolemy, the aux is the apogee. It's the point where a planet is the farthest it can be. If the Earth is at the center, and the planet's epicycle is here, and the planet is riding on a cycle, there it's as far from the Earth as it can be. In Greek, it's an apogee. In Latin, translated from Arabic, it's an aux. So what this means in Ptolemy is the position of a planet at a very particular time. Alberti, however, we saw that he changed Thucydides, so he certainly didn't matter changing an Arabic-Latin astronomical term. I call the aux the longest curve and withdrawal from a straight line that a bending line makes. One approaches this point not with a straight line, but with a winding one, and likewise, one should depart from it with a winding line. Now, that may sound a little confusing. I don't think Alberti found it easy to describe what he was doing, but I think what he means is clear. An aux is not the farthest point from anything, except the farthest point from the continuous line that the walls of the river would make if they were straight or simply curved. It's a bump. Well, if you know your Ptolemaic astronomy, you know that planetary orbits have bumps too. Lots of historians will tell you that the Greeks imagined planetary motion as uniform and circular. But in fact, of course, they didn't. They imagined planetary motion as composed of spheres carrying out uniform circular motions. But the planet itself didn't ride on a circle, on a sphere that was right with the Earth at its center. And the planet would be riding on a second sphere that was riding on the sphere, the larger sphere. So the line that a planet actually describes in Ptolemy is conical, spherical. Kepler, working on the orbit of Mars, called it the via buccosa, the bumpy path. When you read Ptolemy and learn how to use them, you don't see this, but what you learn to follow is the path that a planet is actually following. Alberti models his reconstruction of the city on that. You follow the path of the wall or the river. The big difference is that he shows you that, his system will show you that path if you carry it out. So, what we have in Alberti, it seems to me, is an extraordinary instance of that kind of interdisciplinary work that is characteristic of this Roman world. It's a discovery or a device in which geography, astronomy, surveying, and other skills come together and produce something that had never actually existed before. How influential was it? Well, some of the people doing images of Rome did pay attention to what the scholars were saying. Piero Masaio is not interested, so far as we know, in Alberti's map, but he was talking to the scholars. On this version of his map, I think it's the one he did for the port of Urbino. He takes part in a controversy which divided the scholars in Rome. Where was Peter crucified? The standard answer was in the Circus of Nero at the Vatican. Flavio Biondo thought he was crucified at the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere. But Maffeo Veggio thought he was crucified way up there at San Pietro in Montorio, where Bramante's Tempietto now looks out over the city. And so Piero, by putting that there, shows us that he's talking to these people. He's listening to them, listening to their debates and interested in them. Another piece of evidence may show a more direct influence. This was discovered by Silvia Madallo, a wonderful historian of Rome. It's an illustration from a copy of Euclid's Elements that belonged to Francesco del Borgo, a long unknown architect, banker, scholar, papal secretary, who was really rediscovered by Christophe Frommel. And in this image, you're standing not on Monte Mario, but in the Papal Gardens, which is already a kind of powerful cultural claim. You're looking out on the city from the Papal Gardens, which are above the city and dominate it. And what you see, laid out very accurately, are the Papal Palace in the front, and the Tower of Old St. Peter's, other things which are in Trastevere, and then the Castel Sant'Angelo over here at the near the bridge, and there's the Pantheon. So it's layer after layer of Rome, laid out very much as you would do if you were making Alberti's circular plan, but making the pole the Papal Gardens over the city rather than the Capitoline Hill. And this seems to indicate that Alberti did talk about his work with some people. They also, and this is perhaps even more surprising, had some connection with power and reshaping the city, and I'll finish with that. Alberti and Flavio Biondo pioneered, among other things, underwater archaeology. In the late 1440s, they went to Lake Nemi, this beautiful, beautiful lake in the Alban Hills, a little less than 20 miles from Rome, and they sought to raise one of the two Roman pleasure barges that lay on the bottom of the lake, which was so clear you could actually see them when the conditions were right. They imported divers from Genoa. Alberti said they were more like fish than men. They strung barrels across the lake. They put in some sort of crank. The divers hooked one of the ships. They turned the crank. They turned the crank. They turned the crank. And then the prow of the ship broke off, and that was the end of the experiment. So the first underwater archaeology was catastrophic. And then this is something that couldn't have been done without patronage. It was Prospero Gonzaga, a rich cardinal, who actually supported the investigation. And though the actual effort to bring the ships back up ended catastrophically, Alberti took the occasion to learn things that he would not otherwise have done. He studied and actually went through the emissarium, the Roman spillway for the lake, which made sure that the lake water didn't become stagnant and that it didn't overflow by taking overflow through that tunnel into the hills. 1,600 meters of masonry-lined tunnel, which Alberti explored, greatly impressing his readers. Here you see the manuscript on the architecture that belonged to Bernardo Bembo, and you see Alberti describing, we see how the water works, and Bembo saying, yes, we saw. So this is a new kind of knowledge. And Alberti applied it in a way which really speaks to the themes I've tried to bring together. In talking about triangulation, he says, demonstrating these things isn't easy, but the thing itself isn't hard, and it's quite amusing, and by means of it, many other things can be done. By these means, I was able to locate a certain ancient aqueduct of which appeared some remains, and the paths were frail, the tunnel was frail, and blocked off in the hill. What Alberti was describing here was the Aqua Vergine, one of the many non-functional aqueducts of ancient Rome. And it's a complicated aqueduct. It follows one built by Agrippa. It turns. It's not at all easy to follow. And Alberti, presumably at Nicholas's orders, in 1453 supervised the opening up of the tunnel, the opening up of the ventilation slots, which were vital, and the creation of a very handsome new fountain, in which you see with the papal arms and a commemorative inscription. And we actually know there's some dispute about whether this is by Alberti, but it was. One of the things Alberti liked to do, he liked to tweak people. When he did inscriptions, he liked in each inscription to take one UM or AM, and instead of writing the M, abbreviate it as scribes did in manuscripts. He didn't do that in Roman inscriptions, and Alberti knew that perfectly well. It was just a tweak he liked to do, I don't know quite why, but at all events, the fact that that's there really suggests that this is an Albertian inscription, and the handsomeness and plainness of the original Trevi fountain suggests that too. So, this is really something quite extraordinary. Control of water really matters in Rome. It's not easy to get fresh water clean water into the city. That's a responsibility of government, which had been basically lost in the Middle Ages. And it's the popes who really revived this within a century, Rome had become the city of fountains that we know now, as aqueduct after aqueduct was restored. It's a wonderful story that Pamela Long has told in part in her book Engineering the Eternal City, and there are other great people working on the waters of Rome. So here you have coming together knowledge, space, power, the creation of a kind of papal soft power, with Alberti using these distinctive skills that he had brought together by study and by practice to create something which was novel, impressive, exemplary. There are many other examples, but I will spare you those. What I will say is that this seems to me to be characteristic of the person and also of the enterprise in which he was engaged, in which the recovery of ancient knowledge and ancient skills, the transformation of urban space, the creation of new notions of urban planning, of patronage, and of architects and their work all come together in a way that they would come together elsewhere in Italy in the second half of the century, and many, many powerful combinations. So power, knowledge, space, and Leon Battista Alberti. It's a great combination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that survey and also deep dive into a new reading into Alberti's description of Rome and underwater archaeology. So we have time for questions, and I open the floor. Please try to be sweet and focused in your questions, and please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question about his measurement of the walls. So that's, I think, if I understand right, that's what's in GIS called a polyline, a way to represent a
Right.
line that can be curved. So if he's the first to do that, or in Rome, what did they do before that? How do you survey plots of land? For example, if you have to have 90 degrees.
Well, you can survey, but you're not trying usually to produce this sort of exact image. And I think that's particularly the point. No, there's no question where the walls are. The walls are there. And you can note that, you have a plot of land that abuts the wall, the Aurelian Wall, for example, but the idea of actually mapping the cities, I think the most interesting part is the one he doesn't do with all the roads, because it would truly be a different kind of city map. The city maps, they do eventually take in the roads, and very accurately, but in the 15th century, even the most remarkable plans of Rome really just shirk the question of trying to give a sense of the roads. And what he says at the end, that he wants to show you the roads and the inhabited roofed over area. He's really got a vision of a plan of Rome that will distinguish between the many areas that are empty and the areas that are inhabited. And this is, again, it's just a new kind of precision. The surveying techniques are probably the oldest part of what he's doing. And you can find them in earlier mathematical manuscripts. Bizarrely, Columbia University has a great collection of these, the Plimpton collection. So it's easy, even in New York, to get a sense of how they work. But it's the precision that he's trying to impart. And also, and here is the question that inevitably arises. I didn't mention this in my talk because here everybody does know more than I do. It's very tempting to think of this as a kind of digital mapping. Because after all, what he's providing you with is coordinates. And he doesn't draw a map, which leaves everyone free to take the coordinates and draw their own map, and avoids the problem of how you transmit a map accurately in a world where prints have not yet established themselves. It's really a kind of paradox that Alberti dies just before the print technology begins to establish itself. If he'd lived another 10 years, he might have, he would certainly have been very interested, and he was very interested in printing. But, so one way to think of this that's novel here is that the information is digitized, it's quantified, and transmitted in quantitative form. Now, it's not complete, it's nowhere near what he was hoping to do. which is characteristic of a lot of his very ambitious projects, that they don't quite get finished in the form in which he had imagined them. But it does seem to me that what he's doing is providing a model for mapping things that other cartographers had omitted. I think this is the model for what he does and what others will do with the underground aqueducts, that you can use even if they're blocked, you can use the ventilation holes and distribution points. And in the 16th century, Piero Ligorio and lots of other people map aqueducts in very rigorous ways. But what they're doing is mapping something underground. There too, I think they're using Alberti's technique. That there's room, by the way, for a great book on the discovery of underground Rome, which would also include Nero's Golden House, which the artists discover and pillage, and it becomes the source of the visual codes of the early 16th century without anybody ever giving a map of it or telling you exactly how you get into it. It's a really strange story. And finally, when the Roman catacombs really get opened up in the late 16th and 17th century, Bosio and others find ways of mapping underground catacombs. So there's a whole long story here, but Alberti's the start, and I think for him it's really water, which is the thing you can find out about with this method that nobody else would have been able to find out about. Yeah.
I have a question. It's less related like to the entire thing, but when you talk about that woman that they found perfectly preserved, why did they did they actually if it was dead, then how did they manage to even use it before she got rotten and everything?
This is such a great question. So this is one of the strangest stories of the Renaissance. They find this woman on the Appian Way digging. They decide that she's a Roman woman. There's no particular evidence that she's not, say, an early medieval woman in a sarcophagus. They bring her to the Capitol line, and then we have a massive reports. And the only thing I can compare it to is Twitter now, because no two people say the same thing. She's a beautifully formed woman. I think she's a woman. It's a boy. She's fully grown. She's 12. She's fully beautiful and white and flexible, and you can raise her arms, and you can move her nose, and you can pull her tongue out of her mouth, all of which would suggest that she's like a saint. Say, like the great Roman saint Santa Francesca Romana. They do all those things to Santa Francesca Romana when the first time they try to make her a saint. But other people say, well, it's not surprising she's well preserved because there's 2 inches of embalming stuff around her. So they hire an alchemist who tries to work out how the embalming stuff works. This also happens with saints. Saints are perfectly preserved, and then they tell you, well, actually, she was embalmed. And so something here may be modeled on the digging up of saints and relics, but it's a very strange story. And Lisa Schwab and I tried to put it together, but in the end, you just can't know exactly what happened. The best part is that she writes a poem. Someone writes a poem for her in Latin, basically saying, just leave me alone. And you have to have a lot of sympathy for that. Yeah.
Thank you. It was really fascinating. From what you say, can we say that this humanistic interest, this in cartography, geography, all this urban imagining of the city affected the interest of the Pope in the real transformation of the city into what we see in 16th century Rome?
Absolutely, but it's never perfect. The match is never perfect because, of course, the popes, even the most classicizing popes, have other things that are on their mind, because they are popes. But we can really see this, and I realized I was already too long. I stopped, but I had a section on the Benedictine loggia that Pius II builds, which is this beautiful loggia built out of spolia before he forbids the taking of spolia. in which the Pope can come out and speak to the public. He didn't live long enough, it's finished under his successor. And he also builds these beautiful stairs of marble leading up to it. And if you read Alberti on the art of building, says, you need stairs for a temple or other public building. That's what really makes the entrance dramatic. And they have to be in 7s or in 9s. And then there has to be a rest, and then 7 more, 9 more, and then another rest, which is how the loggia stairs were built. And and the point of this was to have a dramatic way to approach the Vatican, and to have a place where the Pope could actually be exposed to the people. One of the problems with, say, Nicholas's papacy was he wasn't very visible. He tended to be in the papal palace, in the buildings in Trastevere, and it was a real question, how does the Pope speak to pilgrims? How does the Pope speak to ordinary people? Alberti complains about this and on the art of building. Says, in the old days, the bishop preached. The only person who preached in antiquity, he's thinking of Augustine's Confessions, where he talks about Ambrose preaching in Milan, it was the bishop who spoke, who was there in front of the people. So the idea of a benediction loggia was that the Pope would speak to the people in a public way. Again, it's about soft religious power. And Pius II has a wonderful description when he's bringing the head of St. Andrew to the Vatican. He says he climbed the stairs, but he couldn't walk, so he must have been carried up the stairs. And he gets to the top, and the piazza is full, and it's a noise like the ocean of people listening to him, and he speaks to them. This is a very Albertian moment. It's almost been choreographed by Alberti, who is clearly one of his advisors. And the Benedictine loggia is a very Albertian structure because it's borrowed from the Colosseum, which was a source he used as well. So there's a way in which the Pope, is really, after all, the head of the church and needs to use these things for religious purposes. Alberti and his friends are, in a way, most interested in what Rome was like at its imperial zenith. But there's nobody else who can really tell you the things you need to know if you're a pope about what an arcade or a loggia should look like, where you can get the proper spolia to decorate it, how you can make a stable structure. So it's a combination that works. It might be sometimes it's a difficult marriage. There is one group of humanists who meet in the catacombs, and they give each other Roman names and titles, and scurrilous things circulate about them, and they're actually jailed by the Pope for a period and tortured and made to they weren't doing anything very harmful, apparently, but so you can be too classical for the Pope, but on the whole it works. Yeah, Mary.
Yes, that's probably a wonderful segue, because I just wanted to ask, so you really emphasized brilliantly the living classical, but in those very years, in fact, that year, there's the other Rome that is disappearing, and there's that obviously lots of people coming over, all sorts of both technical and classical literary knowledge. Is there any sign that other Rome, Constantinople, as it was, is playing any role in feeding, particularly around issues of building?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Almagest comes to the Vatican Library thanks to Cardinal Bessarion, who actually pays George of Trebizond to translate it. And when Pius II is bringing Andrew, he and Bessarion meet and give speeches. And Pius, as Bessarion, was long-winded and boring, but so it's really East and West coming together as the head of St. Andrew itself was brought from Greece. So yes, absolutely, there is a consciousness, but it's a bit of supersessionist consciousness. Rome is now taking back its position as the real Rome. One very interesting question is what those city views of Piero del Massaio are actually for. And Federico da Montefeltro had a set, and it's been suggested that he was interested in the possibility of a crusade because his set includes Constantinople as well as Rome. And you have the geographical information in a way, you have the sort of the city view. So it's possible that there is certainly crusading thought. Jim Hankins and others and Margaret and Zerb have recovered serious crusading, writers in the 15th century and after. So, that was clear. But on the whole, Rome, they're more interested in getting things into Latin than they are in presenting the Greek. So, they have a copy of the works of Hippocrates in the Vatican, but the really important thing is to get it translated into Latin. That's what makes it useful in this culture. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Does the measurements and the precision measurements have some kind of religious or motivation? Because we know that pilgrims in the Holy Land used to measure buildings as a religious practice.
It's a really good question, and there's a lot of that going on. Adam Beaver has written about the building of, surrogate sacred sites in Iberia, which are, again, done with very, very careful and precise measurements. But in Alberti, there is no trace of this. He writes as if it's a purely secular enterprise, and he doesn't say there's nothing special about churches. There are churches he gives coordinates for, but there are also other kinds of building and arches. So in Alberti, it seems to be much more something that comes as an inheritance from Brunelleschi and the other artists and architects of the early 15th century, some of whom supposedly came to Rome and did careful measurements of their own. I'm always inclined to take him more seriously than some people do. He doesn't say much about things that he actually did, which leads me to think he's usually telling the truth. He may be exaggerating a little, but he's kind of actually talking about things that he did or tried to do. And so I think he is just really passionate about this idea that we need to have accurate measurements of Rome if we're going to rebuild Rome and make it what it ought to be, that this is a sort of foundation, and nobody has them. So he's really trying to find a way to do that, and of course he doesn't get there. The other thing that I think really does spread is this consciousness of how varied Rome is. Pius II, and if you don't know it, Pius II's Commentaries is the best book ever written. It's just magnificent. And it starts with him at the border between Scotland and England, threatened by raiders, hiding for the night with 80 beautiful Scottish virgins. And he says that he remained pure all night and God saved them. The whole thing goes on in that way. It's a fabulous book. So when he talks about going through Rome with this procession, so then we got into a narrow street and my guards had to use their cudgels to get the people out of the way. And then we're in the inhabited part, and then we take a turn and we're in the uninhabited part again. It's a real consciousness of the varieties of urban landscape that I think is partly his own observation, but also partly the fact that he was working with Alberti, with Rossellino, with Del Borgo. He was working with people who were very conscious of this and thinking about what kind of stamp he could put on this urban fabric. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Absolutely invigorating and really enjoyable. I was really struck by, it might seem like a micro detail, but when he's talking about everything he's measured and how he's, it sounded, in fact, maybe this is obvious, but so much like Brunelleschi as it's recounted in Manetti, and how unusual it was to be there measuring. And I'm wondering, and Alberti, a lot's been made of their, what he takes from Brunelleschi. And I'm wondering, do you think this is another echo? And I don't mean to say that also to say Alberti's only, following what others are doing, because I think he's just so fertile. There's just so much.
There's a huge amount of Florence in Alberti. And he's clearly incredibly impressed by Brunelleschi. Alberti writes the first modern treatise on painting, and we now think that the Italian version is the first version, and that has a preface to Brunelleschi, in which he dedicates it to Brunelleschi and asks Brunelleschi to correct his errors, which is, for a proud writer, that's a kind of powerful thing to do. So he's very, very impressed by Brunelleschi. In one of his treatises, he says the Duomo could take in the entire population of Tuscany. So he's deeply impressed, and I'm sure that he knew about Brunelleschi as someone who did this kind of measurement in a very serious way. The other thing is there are Florentine things in Alberti's urbanism. So he wants streets to turn and wander. He's not only a believer in long, straight streets, and that's very Florentine, like the streets in the very center of Florence, which they change so that you turn around a corner and there's the Signoria, and you're surprised by it. And as Tannenbaum showed, you have this real sort of experience of mystery and revelation. That's in Architecture and the art of building too. So I do think that he went back to, Alberti was a bastard son of the Alberti. He can't come back until the Medici come in, and because they've been exiled. So he comes to Florence as an adult. And in this letter to Brunelleschi, there's this wonderful passage about the exile in which we Alberti have grown old. It's so the discovery of Florence is huge for him. And I think it's probably true to say that he's seeing Rome in some ways through that experience of seeing Florence in the 1430s. Of course, he sees it just when the cathedral is dedicated and the Pope is there. So, so that's a huge urbanistic experience in its own light. So yeah, I'm sure that he has these precedents well in mind. What I don't know is anybody else who does this sort of combination of book learning and practice in quite the same way. And that really seems to make him not unique probably, but distinctive for the period. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering about the function, the perceived function, but also the actual function in the reception of the coordinates. So you suggested, it was very suggestive to think of, okay, I give you the coordinates, you map it, but if we weren't there to map it, what are the people in art, or how do people
The
consume
one
art?
real concrete piece of evidence is that Francesco del Borgo miniature, which does seem to reflect a kind of very similar way of measuring, and he's exactly the person you'd expect to be interested. So it does make some sense. It's really hard. There are only, 4 manuscripts of the description of the city of Rome. None of them show signs of use, somebody trying to figure it out. And so we really, he's not somebody who is brilliant at securing the posterity of all of his works. On the Art of Building is printed in 1485, and it's reprinted and it receives exegesis and is marked up by important people. That's a book which has a huge distribution and impact. But on painting, has most of its sort of distribution kind of silently. We know that Leonardo reads it, but it's hard to trace much of its impact. His code, he writes this great book on how to make a cipher using cipher wheels. It's basically the German Enigma code from World War II. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, nobody gets that, so they go on using the old substitution codes, which aren't nearly as effective. So I don't see kind of a direct impact, but I think the idea that, okay, you have points, from points you can map, is what makes it possible for him to think of mapping an underground lost aqueduct. And a lot of people do that in the 16th century. And I think at least the example is there, and they're using similar techniques. And they get more and more sophisticated. So Piero Ligorio really knows how an aqueduct is made, and he distinguishes between the ventilation holes and the distribution barrels and so on. But I think that comes from Alberti. It's inspired by him, and it's inspired by the example of the Aqua Vergine. If for no other reason than it stops functioning again fairly soon, so people have to keep trying to repair it before they do other aqueducts. He's not somebody who had a lot of mentees, also, which distinguishes him from someone like Raphael, who trained lots of people. He doesn't seem to have been interested for whatever reason in doing that. So it's his influence is sometimes like his mapping of the aqueduct subterranean.
Let me ask a question myself. To what extent do you see this as an attempt by Alberti to develop a universal method for depicting cities? Because if you look at the 16th century the vertical view was not the norm. It's not the oblique, and what Lucianuti called the perspective plan was the aesthetic adopted by everyone. So
I think he is really interested in the orthogonal plan, and he's trying to give you a method that would make it possible to do that for any city in a rigorous way, and not just to do it, but to transmit the evidence in the data in a rigorous way. For perspective views, it's hard. I mean, I'm sure he was interested in them because his understanding of architecture very much involves what you see from a distance, what you see from close up. You don't think about Brunelleschi and not think about perspective, as he certainly did. So I think that but I don't know of anything in Alberti that shows a real interest in producing views like Piero del Massaio's, but more rigorous. You and I do suspect that some of his inspiration comes into the 16th century views, the much more rigorous perspective views, which are trying to build in accurate measurements and to show you, the living detail of the city. I forget which one it is, Jessica, you'll know. There's one where I love where suddenly you see little awnings in the windows. As the streets open up and the sun comes in, people realize it's really hot in Rome.
Oh gosh,
It's late 16th century.
It sounds like Tempesta to me.
Yeah, I think it may be Tempesta.
Yeah.
And after all, one of the things that is a real kind of there are a lot of wonderful blunders in Renaissance views of antiquity. One, I think, is the Renaissance palace, because I do think the model for that was the ground plan of Roman apartment houses, the insula. And so they're kind of imagining Roman palaces, sort of ordinary noble palaces, as much bigger than they were, because they're imagining them as whole apartment houses. And that's that's what makes Rome and Florence the cities of gigantic palaces, the size of a city block that they become by the 16th century. So that's one of those kind of romantic, interesting mistakes with enormous consequences. There are certainly, there are plenty of others. The idea that an obelisk should stand by itself, which is, something the Romans knew better than that, as you see at Augustus's tomb. But they change it, and then Alberti kind of takes that on. So, I think in the end, he's an amazing scholar, but scholarship is not all he's interested in. And that involves compromise, that involves using the discoveries for practical purposes, and all of that involves sometimes changing them in order to use them. There's still so little we know. Yeah, Jessica.
I would, so to follow up on something you were saying, made me think of this, but I've always been struck by the fact how coordinate-based that map is, with the idea that map is, and then, but Alberti is thinking about architecture, and the big step I think that comes with the orthogonal plans that come the following century is that buildings are not points, right?
Right.
Features are not points. So I've always been struck because it seems like it would be such a natural leap for him to have taken.
Absolutely, and I just think it's the practical difficulty that prevents it. He would have had to survey every building, and that's just not possible for one person, however fanatically energetic. No, you're absolutely right. To do this really rigorously would have involved treating not just roads and rivers as things that have to be mapped in their entirety, but buildings themselves.
Or even just to express the concept.
But I think he's trying not to use counters in the way that in Ptolemy's maps there are kinds of counters or in Ptolemaic maps, I should say, there are counters for mountain chains. But in order to avoid that, you're right, he's not being precise in the most fundamental way. But think how many points it would take. There are 175 points in the description, and he doesn't include half of what he said it was going to include. So even for a digital scholar, which I am definitely not, the thought of how many points it would have taken is absolutely terrifying.
Good. I think we can conclude.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Tony. We've had our whole week encapsulated in a single lecture, from digital history to urban spaces to the past and the present to measurement. Many of the points we will be discussing later on this week. So thank you again. Thank you for the questions.